Welcome to this full walkthrough on implementing Stripe subscriptions in a real-life production application. My team and I are releasing an app soon. It's an issue tracker / project management tool. So in this video, I'm going to walk through step-by-step how to do this in a real production app. We're going to go from zero, well, there's already an app, so it's not really zero, but we're going to go from zero billing code to, at the end, a fully implemented billing solution. So I'm going to give you a brief tour of the app structure, a bit of an overview of what we're going to accomplish, and then we'll get right into code. So in our app, the top level object is called a workspace. Think kind of like a Slack workspace. So each subscription will be at the workspace level. We'll utilize the Stripe feature of setting a quantity on a subscription to bill per user. We're going to have two plans. One is our hobby plan, so that's just free, and then one is our pro plan, so that's $15 per month per user. This means that hobby plans won't have a subscription, but pro plans will. We're also going to implement a feature where workspaces can be comped, so think internal use or demos, things you don't want to be billable, but you still want to have those pro level features in production. You can comp a workspace with this functionality. We're going to utilize Stripe fully for all things billing. We're not going to build out any billing UI ourselves. Instead, we're going to link to Stripe Checkout in order to start the subscription. And then for any management of the subscription, that's changing your payment methods, canceling, etc., we're going to utilize the Stripe billing portal. Now, this is a very common approach to building out SaaS subscriptions, but the actual implementation will be specific to how our code base is structured. So let me just show you very quickly how that is. It is a monorepo, so we're using a turborepo monorepo. We have several apps and several packages. So one app is the API app. That's our GraphQL API app. We'll be utilizing that here, as well as adding a webhook for listening to Stripe webhooks. We also have a worker app, which is the background job worker. We'll be utilizing that here to synchronize some state in the background. In packages, we have a database package, so we'll be updating our Prisma setup for some new columns. We have a Docker package, which actually doesn't contain any JavaScript code or TypeScript code. It's merely to run Docker Compose in our turborepo. So we will be utilizing this to add a Stripe service to listen to webhooks in local development. And then finally, we have a queue package where we add our background job kind of setup. And then finally, we have our store package. Our store package is, you can think of as our business logic layer. It sits on top of the database, but underneath maybe the exposed endpoints in the API. So we're going to go through a 6-step process of implementing this. We're going to heavily utilize Cursor for this in its agent mode. If you haven't used agent mode in Cursor, it's really stellar. And also, I want to make a huge mention to Theo, who has created this Stripe recommendations repo on GitHub. If you're going to implement Stripe, read every word of this. It's extremely valuable. A lot of our implementation today will be based upon this, but we will take it to full fruition. We will take it actually to full functionality. Highly, highly worth it. Thank you very much, Theo, for this. Okay, let's get right into code, or at least right into prompting, that is. I've taken some time here and written out all the prompts ahead of time, so we'll review those together and see what Cursor does. First thing we're going to do is update the database model. So like I said, our data model really centers around a workspace object, which is our top level object. So on this, I want to add a Stripe customer ID, a billing mode string. So this is either going to be standard billing mode or comped billing mode. We're going to add a plan string, which could either be hobby or pro. And then I also want to have a subscriptions table. So in this, I want a workspace to be able to have one subscription. So we're always syncing in the state of the current subscription, and we can listen to this from Stripe and keep things updated locally. In Theo's documentation on how he implements Stripe, I've essentially taken his data structure for what he stores on a subscription and copied it here so that Cursor can create the proper database fields for us in Prisma and Postgres. So we're going to do this step by step. I'm not going to paste this whole thing in because I think that would still be a lot for AI. Let's just start with this. So I'm going to take our database section here. I'm going to do a Command I to open up our cursor chat. Make sure you're in agent mode. I'm going to be using Claude 3.5 Sonnet. Oh my gosh. Okay. Yes. So I checked like 30 minutes ago and I did not have access to Claude 3.7 Sonnet, but I do now. So this will be literally the first time I have ever used this. Okay, this is really cool. So I'm going to paste in this part of our plan here, and we're going to say implement step 1. Okay, so it's going in here, and I didn't even provide it any other context. Throughout this, I did provide it some kind of directory names here to go looking into for some hints, especially since it is a monorepo, and there is a lot to look through here. Let's see. Error connecting to Anthropic. Okay, well. So Claude 3.7, I think quite literally just came out today. Or no, I think it came out today. So there's already some issues at Anthropic. We're going to hit resume and see if this works, but we may already be hitting some caps here. We may have to revert back to Claude 3.5. And we are. Okay, so we're going to revert back to Claude 3.5 for this. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. There we go. Okay, let's try again. Implement step 1. Let's go. So it's going through and looking at our database package. It's seeing that it is a Prisma setup. So it's going to go in and update our Prisma schema. It's going to add our new columns to Prisma. Now, this is a really cool thing in agent mode in that it is going to suggest commands and allow us to go ahead and run them right here. It already knows it needs to get into the database package directory. It already sees that I'm using Prisma Migrate for migrations, and it's suggesting adding a migration here and even naming it for me, Add Workspace Billing and Subscriptions. That's fantastic. So let's hit run. That's really awesome. Again, this step is just setting up our database for what we need. I expect this one to be fairly simple. Let's hit review changes. I don't know what this does. Oh, that's cool. Huh, interesting. Okay, so we have added the Stripe customer ID. That's nullable. Billing mode, which is not nullable, defaults to standard. Great. Plan, which is not nullable, defaults to hobby. Great. And it's added a has one subscription relationship, so we will accept those changes. We'll scroll down a bit here. We do have subscription. We have this here, maps it to subscriptions, workspace is unique. This is looking pretty good. The only other thing I would add in here is I would add a unique on subscription and ID, and in fact, I would change that to Stripe subscription ID. I would also want to change this to Stripe price ID just to not confuse this with being our own names for these items. So now I need to update the migration file with the updated column names. And it's noticed what I did by adding Stripe in front of subscription ID and price ID. It also realizes that I need to now update the migration. So it's going to delete. That's interesting. Okay. Let's go ahead and run this, see what this does. That's fine. I don't mind losing that data. Okay, we run this. I've updated the schema file. It should have generated a new, let's see, let's check on this. It should have generated, yes, we only have one migration file. It has a Stripe subscription ID and a Stripe price ID. So that looks great. Okay, so I think that's a good step 1. And this would be a good time to go in here and commit up these changes. So I'm going to do just that. So very quickly, we'll review that we have our Prisma changes and we have our one migration file. So we're going to update database schema for billing. Awesome. Okay, we can proceed to step 2. Step 2 is we want to utilize Stripe Checkout for creating a checkout session. So whenever someone wants to subscribe, Stripe Checkout is really awesome because it will generate a unique authenticated link in order to begin the checkout process. It directs them over to Stripe so you don't have to build out any UI, you don't have to build out all the different scenarios between credit cards and bank accounts and utilizing link or different types of pay. It's very, very easy. So in this step, I'm saying that we want to add a create checkout session mutation. Again, I'm using GraphQL. So we want to add a mutation for creating a checkout session. This should return a checkout. We want to return a checkout URL. And by recommendation of Theo, and I agree with this, always create the Stripe customer before creating the checkout session. Stripe does allow you to create the customer during the checkout session, but that could have some race conditions. And this way we always know that the workspace has the same customer. Also, I want to place really the business logic of this checkout session and most things that we're doing with Stripe in my store package. Again, that's kind of our business logic layer. And I want to add some GraphQL docs. So let's copy this in, paste this, and say proceed to step 2. Okay, so this is already really cool. We're using Pothos to create our GraphQL schema. Pothos is a fantastic GraphQL schema creator. We are using, this is the first project that I've been using it in, and I absolutely love it because it's TypeScript top to bottom. You don't have to do code generation for GraphQL schema files and TypeScript types. It's really, really great. And Cursor has picked up on a number of things here. So I told it which file to put this in. So thank you for listening, Cursor. But it has also seen that on these calls to our workspace settings, that we have this authorize workspace admin call. So it's automatically pulled that in for us, which is fantastic. It is also now, for the first time, creating a billing module in our store package. And it's doing a number of things, which is great. It's pulling in our database package to query Prisma. It's going to use the Stripe package. It knows that we're using ES Toolkit, which is a more modern version of Lodash. It also includes invariant in here. It is utilizing an old Stripe API. So that's already something in here I know that I want to go fix. It's creating a create checkout session function. That's great. So it's going to go find the workspace, create or get the Stripe customer. It's going to save the workspace ID to its metadata. That's fantastic. Update our local persisted workspace with that Stripe customer ID. And it's going to create a checkout session. One of the really great things about doing something like this with AI is that Stripe is so widely used that it already knows how to use this. All these things, like I didn't tell it only to accept cards. I didn't tell it about line items. I didn't tell it how to use this API. It's really just kind of doing it. It's even creating success and cancel URLs. There are a few small things wrong with this, but I can go in and fix that. And there we go. So, and it's returning the URL. That's fantastic. Okay, it's also adding in some environment variables that we'll need to use. So that's fantastic. And now it wants us to, in the store, add the Stripe and Zod packages. Oh, this environment file is new. Oh, well, thank you, Cursor. Okay, so let's run this command. I don't mind adding Stripe and Zod packages. It was not in the right directory, so it's realized that. We'll try this again. This video may ironically include very little coding by hand. Okay, It is going in and exposing the billing module from our store package. It's working on imports and exports. Ooh, why is it creating an errors file? That we'll definitely want to fix. We already have errors in here somewhere. And it is adding documentation. Okay, so it thinks it's done, but I do already have errors set up in this store types file. So I'm just going to tell it to do that here. So use existing errors from, and I'll just say store types. So now it knows that it doesn't need to create a new one anymore. So we will accept deleting the new file. Oh, and is it listening to me? It happened to pick up that it was utilizing the old Stripe version, and along the way just went in and fixed that. So that's kind of nice. It says the remaining linter errors are related to the database schema not being updated. I'm not sure if that's correct or not, but it doesn't hurt to go in and generate this. Let's do this via PNPM. By the way, if you just caught that, you can edit the command before you hit run, so that's really nice. What? How likely are you to recommend Prisma? Whoa. There's a net promoter score survey in the CLI. Okay. I mean, I would say 10 because I freaking love Prisma. I'm tempted to knock that down or two because it's interrupted me here in the CLI, but oh, well, now it's continued on its own. Okay. Never seen a net promoter score in the terminal before. All right, it's doing some interesting things such as defining environment variables in a types file. I don't think that I would do that, but that's okay. All right, let's go and review the changes. This looks a bit weird. Instead, I'm actually just going to accept all, and we'll go over to our get diff and review the changes from here. This is often how I would do things. Okay, in our package.json, in our store package, that's our business logic layer, we've added Stripe. Sounds great to me. That also means our PNPM lock file changes. That's fantastic. Our migration file looks like it might not have gotten picked up in my last commit. Somehow we ended up with two different migration files. Well, we don't want that. So I'm going to delete one of these, and we'll continue on. I don't want to declare specific types for environment variables. Instead, I would do this through some sort of file or just do checks in line for these and throw errors. So I'm actually going to reject this change. So I'm going to discard this. I do kind of like that it added this environment file and is using Zod to check our keys here. This is very nice. Okay, whew. What happened here? It did a lot of editing of how I've exported things. I don't want it to do that much editing. This is in our store package. Really, all it needed to do was export billing. So I'm going to open this, but discard the changes. I'm going to go back to where it was and export billing. And we'll go up here and we will manually import billing. That's the diff I'm looking for. Now let's look at the billing file it created inside of store. So we have a create checkout function. It's looking for a workspace. If there is a Stripe customer ID, it uses it. If not, it will create one with Stripe. That's great. I'm getting some squigglies here. Let me go ahead and restart my Typescript server locally. It may just not be picking up my Prisma changes. Okay, that looked like it fixed it. Okay, so this looks good. It's using our price ID. One thing I'm not going to get into this video is how to set these environment variables up in your environment, because that really depends on how your app is set up. You could use a package like .env to load .env files in your local setup, or if you're using Docker, you'd load environment variables differently there. So it would be up to you to uh, add and configure these environment variables, but just know that these are here. Also, in our URLs, we happen to use a slug in here instead of the workspace ID. So other than that, I think this looks pretty good. Okay, so we'll add that in. Switching on over to our API, it's added a billing file to create checkout session. We have been prefixing our settings mutations with the word settings, so that's interesting that it picked that up. It's returning just a string. I might prefer to return an object with checkout URL as a field on that object. So let's do that instead. Let's say return an object here with checkout URL as a field on that object. It should pick up how to create an object in Pothos in the GraphQL schema creator and update to that. And again, it picked up our authorized workspace admin that we've been creating. That is really nice. It has created the appropriate return object for us in Pothos. So it's created an object with a checkout URL. It's exposing that as a string, and this all looks good. So we will accept this, and we'll add that in. Okay, next up, it did export this type. It's returning that as an object, so that looks good. Now, it's exporting this from our billing module. I suspect it did not export this type from billing, so we'll need to go in and do that here. So we need to make sure that that type is available, checkout session is available for other packages to use. And finally, it added some documentation for us. It's added some documentation on how to call these mutations and what to expect. Excellent. All right, so that was step 2. That was creating the checkout URL. In fact, let's go in and test this. So I ordered these steps in a very purposeful manner. I wanted us to get to something we could test. There's not much we could test around the database model, but we can go in and try out this new checkout session here, see if this actually works. So I've seeded some data into our local database, and looking at our workspaces table, I can see we have one workspace here. It is starting on standard billing mode on the hobby plan, and we don't have a Stripe customer yet. So if I call that checkout URL, even without visiting the URL that it returns, I should expect a Stripe customer to be created. Okay, so off camera, I've made sure that my environment variables are set and are loading into my application. I've opened up my GraphQL console here so I can test out some queries. I'm loading up our local workspace, getting its ID, and now I want to call this create checkout session mutation, pass it in my workspace ID, and get this checkout URL. So if I execute that, we get a Stripe checkout URL, and if I check my database, then I can see that the Stripe customer ID was created and updated to our database. In fact, if I just go to this URL, I should be able to open up a checkout here. Fantastic. Now I am noticing it's only charging me $15, but it should be $15 per user. So let's go in and fix that before we make our commit. Okay, let's be sure to set the quantity on the subscription during checkout to the number of people, active people in the workspace who are associated with a user. What's nice about having one long-running context here and doing this whole process together is I don't have to keep going back and adding in context to the agent. It's using the history here of everything we've done to be able to know where things are. Okay, so let's take a look at the changes here. It's just noted this in the docs. That's fine. And in the store file, it has during the checkout session added something to get the active user count. So this is the people, counting the people in the workspace who are not archived, who are associated with the user, adding a little air condition there, and changing the quantity from a hard-coded one to the active user account. So that is exactly what we want there. All right, let's go back to our checkout session. Let's generate a new URL. And voila, now it's $45 because we have 3 users in the workspace and we see a quantity 3. Fantastic. Okay, so let's commit this up. We've added ability to generate Stripe checkout URL. Next up in our process is after someone checks out, Stripe has the ability to send us a webhook to let us know when the payment was successful. So I want to add an endpoint that Stripe can connect to, send us these webhooks, and when we receive one of those webhooks, call out to Stripe, get the current subscription status and information, sync that into the database, into the new subscriptions table we added in step 1. And also for local development, Stripe has a Docker container that we can add that will help us to listen to Stripe webhooks. And instead of figuring out how to expose a public endpoint for a locally running process, we can just use this Docker container that will listen to Stripe endpoints for us. In the Theo notes here, he's added a very specific list. If I scroll down, a very specific list of all of the applicable events that you should listen for. And anytime one of these are called, just go update the subscription state. So we're going to use this list of events. Okay, let's do this. Command I. Let's implement step 3. So as a part of this process, I'm asking it to add a sync Stripe data function to our store, our business logic layer. It should accept a Stripe customer ID and then go get that subscription from Stripe and upsert it into our database, meaning insert it if it doesn't exist or update it if it does. So let's see what it's doing here. So it's adding a sync Stripe data function to our billing module. That's good. It's accepting a customer ID, calling out to Stripe to get that, finding the workspace by the customer ID. If there are no subscriptions, delete any existing subscription. I don't know that I want to do that, but that's a good question. If there is a subscription, go ahead and upsert it here. That's good. It's in a very strange way creating our IDs for us. I have a function that does that. So we might have to clean some of that up manually. That's okay. And it is updating the workspace plan based upon the subscription status. There is a bit of an issue with how it's doing that though, so we'll also go ahead and fix that up. Okay, let's continue on with what it's trying to do here. It's adding a webhook handler. It wants to add Express to our API app. That sounds good. We asked it to do that. As of today, our API app is only using GraphQL Yoga. We don't have any other endpoints right now, so I want to add in Express so that we can add a webhook endpoint for Stripe to come in and integrate Yoga with Express. So that's what it's doing here. And now it's getting to our Docker Compose file and adding in the Stripe service for listening to webhooks. Okay, so it's gotten through the steps here, but I already know there's going to be some things that we'll want to adjust. All right, so let's just hit accept all. And again, I find it a little easier to review the changes just by looking at the git diff here. So let's start with something easy. Package.json in the API. We've got dependencies on Express and Typesexpress. This is fine, although I usually like adding types to the dev dependencies. So we'll just move those down. And that sounds good. And that will come with PNPM log file changes. It keeps wanting to add .env files for parsing our environment variables. I'm not going to do that in this video just because that requires a little more juggling in this particular application that I want to do right now. So I'm going to continue to just get those off process.env. So I'm going to discard this. Okay, so it created a basic server setup for Express. However, it just really completely ignored our existing yoga setup. So let's make sure that it knows about our yoga setup. Let me take a look at where that would be. Yes, that is in our API source index file. So I'm going to go here and say utilize existing yoga setup in API source index. So now it's going to go consolidate those for me. Excellent. It wants to delete the new server file it created. That's fine. Okay, awesome. So again, we'll accept all of those and we'll go back to our git diff review. So it's added in Express. It's added in a Stripe webhook handler. I like that it added that in a different file. I can't remember if I asked it to do that or not. It's added an Express app call here. It's added a post endpoint for webhook Stripe. It's correctly processing this as JSON, but in a raw format because Stripe requires that in order to verify the signature on the payload. It's kept our existing yoga configuration, and it's mounted yoga into Express, and it's added, we don't really need to console log out the webhook endpoint. Okay, that generally looks good to me, although I am going to fix up some of these process.env calls. All right, now in webhooks. I'm going to clean up some of this environment variable handling, but let's check the other things. So relevant events, it has here. Great. We're building a handle Stripe webhook handler. It's grabbing the signature, ensuring that exists. Then it's calling the Stripe webhooks construct event helper here, along with a webhook secret. So you'll need to be sure and populate this from Stripe. You can either get this in the Stripe dashboard, or once you start up a Docker service, it will provide you the webhook secret for you. So it ensures that signature passes. If it is a relevant event, it just says received. Okay, thank you. Oh, I see. If it is not a relevant event, then it just says received and returns. All right. Otherwise, I don't know if that needs to be JSON necessarily, but otherwise it goes in, looks for the customer ID, runs our sync Stripe data function, which is exactly what we wanted to do, awaits that, and returns received. Otherwise, errors out. So this all looks pretty good. Let me just real quick clean up some environment variable handling. We're using GraphQL.tada to generate GraphQL types for our web clients. So I'm just going to go ahead and add those in here to this commit. Our Docker compose file, it created a new one, but we actually already have one. So I'm going to go correct it here and say utilize our existing Docker compose file. And it should then go in and fix up this configuration. Again, this has really kind of been my process with AI, is asking it to do something, letting it do its thing, reviewing its results, and almost becoming you become the CTO of the AI here and PR reviewer of reviewing everything that it's done. Okay, let's accept those changes and go back to see what it's done here. We don't need this compose file anymore. I'm surprised it didn't ask us to delete that. But we do want this latest Stripe service. Okay, great. So it is utilizing the Stripe CLI latest. Fantastic. We've got the API key, Stripe secret key. I happen to know that they like for this to be called, yes, they like for this to be called the Stripe API key. So you don't need to specify this here. It does need to forward it to our locally running service. Our service actually runs on port 4001. And in case you're wondering what this crazy thing is this is a way to call from inside of a Docker container back out to your host machine. This Stripe service is running inside of a container, but my node service is running on my local machine. It's not running in a node container. So this allows us to call back out to that. All right, I don't even think we need this. I think really that's all the config we need. Actually, there is one more thing. I want to be able to load up environment variables into Docker from a .env.local file. So there's a really cool way to specify this in Docker Compose, and that is just specifying that you want to load this env file from .env.local, and that will load up our Stripe API key environment variable that we need for this container. So just make sure you have this file created. I won't do that here on camera. All right, and finally, we have the meat of this thing, which is the syncing of the Stripe data. Let's take a look at this. So this sync Stripe data function, again, it's going to be called whenever one of these webhooks comes through. So we've got a customer ID. I'm initializing our Stripe client here. We're getting the subscriptions. We're finding the workspace by the customer ID, or we're throwing. If you're sharing a sandbox with other developers, chances are you might have subscriptions come through that don't line up with your local workspace IDs. So in this case, you may or may not want to throw here. It really depends on how you're set up to work with other developers on your team or other seed data as you I often blow things up locally and start over. So there may be some lingering subscriptions that don't exist locally. So this might be an area of functionality you want to review for your use case. It says if there are no subscriptions, delete any existing subscription. I think that's what we would want. And then upserting the subscription data. All right, so this is an area where this code could really be cleaned up. I want to clean this up to share the data between create and update and use our gen ID method from Baton DB. I think that's Baton DB. I have this gen ID method that calls nano ID and generates an ID. This is much, much, much better. All right, so we're preparing the subscription data here, and then we're doing an upsert where the update should just be the subscription data. Or if it's a create, then the difference would be that we need to add an ID. We need to make sure we're adding the workspace ID with this. The Stripe subscription ID should be in with the shared data. So let's add that here. Otherwise, this looks good. Next, it wants to update the workspace plan based upon the subscription status. Naively, this looks good, but there are actually, based upon Stripe's various statuses, different ways something can be active. So let's create an isActive helper here. And there are a few different ways this can be active. They could be trialing. So you want them to have pro level features, but they haven't paid yet. They're in a trial. We are not going to offer trials, but that is a valid case. There's another case where it is past due. And this can be, I believe, check the docs on this, but this I can believe can happen if the payment failed and it will give it a day or two in retries. And then finally, if it does fail completely, then it will become canceled. But I do want to allow accounts in a past due state, at least for a couple of days, to continue using it. Again, check the docs on that one to make sure that is correct. Okay, so I think we're in a good state there. Let's commit this up. Actually, let's test this out and make sure that everything's coming through. So I'm going to check. Okay, I have gotten one error in that Stripe was not added as a dependency. Yes, Stripe was not added as a dependency in our API package. So I'm going to go through here and add that. So API, add Stripe. And I'll restart my server and try this again. Okay, there we go. My server started up. Again, I have already configured my environment variables with a price ID, with the Stripe API key, and even the webhook secret. So I leave that for you to do from the Stripe dashboard. But what I do want to do is, again, create a checkout session, go through the checkout process, and see if we get our webhook back from Stripe. Once we get our webhook back, we should get a subscription record created in our database. Let's check our database and ensure that, in fact, we have no subscriptions currently. So after I check out, I would expect a webhook to come through and a subscription to be created. And on our workspace, this plan should update to Pro. Okay, so I'll enter in an email address. I'll enter in the Stripe test card, which is all 42s. We won't save our payment, and we will subscribe. Okay, so it's subscribed. Now it has redirected us back to our success URL, which I don't have running right now. That's totally fine. In your case, you'd want to make sure that this redirects back to your web UI. Now, let's check our database. Refresh. Yes. Okay. Our hobby plan updated to Pro, and our subscription has shown up. So we have subscription for this workspace. Its status is active. It's for a given price. It starts and ends here. It's not canceling. It's a Visa ending in 4242. Haha. So our webhooks are working. The Stripe Docker container is forwarding our webhooks to our local API, and everything is good. Okay, so we can commit these changes up. So we have added webhooks to sync subscription state. Moving right along here. Next up in our plan is I already have an API in GraphQL for fetching a workspace, but I want to be able to show what the billing mode and plan are. So imagine we're building out a UI to be able to subscribe to Baton based upon if they're currently on hobby or currently on pro level. We might display different buttons for them to start their subscription or cancel their subscription or upgrade their subscription or manage billing, etc. So I want to add these two fields to Workspace. So I think this should be a pretty easy one here. Let's try this out. So proceed with step 4. Okay, it's doing some things I really like here. This is what I was hoping. Awesome, awesome. Okay, let me just accept everything, and then we will go through this step by step together. Let's start here. I already have a workspace type defined in our Pothos GraphQL schema, and it's simply adding two different fields on this type, one for billing mode and one for plan. I want these to be enums, or I wanted that. Cursor didn't know this, but it made a good decision here. So we have a billing mode, which is either standard or comped as an enum, And we have a plan, which is either hobby or pro as enum. And it's adding both of those here. So this looks good. We have some red squigglies, but I think that is going to be fixed over here. So on our workspace, we are fetching our workspace entity, and we need to be sure that we are additionally fetching the billing mode and plan along with that. So that is also good there. And then over in the docs, it's added some docs for us for showing that we can fetch billing mode for a given workspace. So that's fine too. Okay, so let's test this out in our GraphQL console. Again, I've already authorized myself here. In your case, this would be whatever API or GraphQL you are using. Let me refetch my schema here to keep this updated. I should have a billing mode and a plan. And there we go. We have billing mode standard, plan pro. So we are billable. I guess standard could be called billable. That might be nice. I'll think about that. And then plan is pro, so meaning we are on the paid plan. That's what we wanted. Well, that was easy enough. So add billing mode and plan fields to workspace. All right, only 2 steps to go. Next up, whenever someone is added to the workspace or archived from the workspace, we want to be sure to update their subscription and change their user count. In Stripe's case, that's called a subscription quantity. That's one of the ways to do it, is setting the quantity on the line item in the subscription. And I want to do this with a background job. So if we are inviting someone to a workspace, let's say that the Stripe API happens to be down for a moment. We don't want that to block inviting someone to a workspace or someone accepting their invite or even archiving someone from a workspace. So anytime any of these actions happen, which would trigger or change the user count in a workspace, we want to queue up a background job to accomplish this. I already have a queue system built into this app as well as a worker to process these jobs. So we'll go in and do this here. So in our queue, we want to add an update subscription quantity job. In our worker, we want to be able to process that job. I want to put the logic of how to do this with Stripe again in our store package, that business logic layer. And then in the API, this is where we want to queue up these jobs to happen at certain points. So when the user accepts an invite to a workspace, that's when the user account goes up. We want to queue up the job. And when a person is archived, that's when a user account goes down. We'd want to queue up the job there. So this looks good. We'll highlight this, Command I, and proceed with step 5. By the way, before I started this session, I tried putting in all the steps in kind of as a one-shot to cursor here. It helps to break it down. Because as you can see, we've been making some changes along the way here. And so it's nice to break this down into some steps. Okay, so it went way overboard here. Now we're going to get into some prompt debugging to see where things went off the rails. Okay, I think I don't quite know where this went wrong. So I think what I'm going to do is discard all the changes. That's again another reason why doing this in steps, committing along the way, if you're going to kind of do it in this AI first mode, is super helpful. Let's revisit our initial notes here. And clearly, I must not have provided it enough context of what to do. I'm going to copy this in again and provide it some more context. So we want in our queue, so let's look at packages.queue. Queue is really very simple. We're starting a new BullMQ queue. We have one job type right now, which is just sending a workspace invite email. Really, we want to just define the job data here. So I'm going to come here and say add these to queue/index. Okay, for the worker, divide these up a bit. Add a background job to update subscription quantity for workspace. Use job defined from queue above. And then in the API, this might have been where it went off the rails. Use the existing mutations in invite here and settings people. Yes. Okay, I think we just probably needed to define some more context here for the AI. So let's try this again. Okay, this is already looking much better. It's using our existing queue data structures and adding in new job types. So if you're running AI prompts like this and you find it's just going off the rails, try providing it more context and direction, especially in a sizable code base. That really helps. Okay, and it's wrapped up much faster that time. So let me accept all changes. Okay, first off, in the current invite schema that we have, I have a function for when a user accepts an invite. So at the bottom of that, we want to queue up a job to update the subscription quantity for workspace. Very simple. It's made a unnecessary change in our types here. I'll just discard that. In people, when we archive a person, our existing mutation that we have here, it's again queuing up the job to update the subscription quantity. That's good. It also did this whenever we unarchive and invite the person back. We actually don't need to do that there because we only need to do this when that person accepts the invite. So I can go ahead and delete this out of here. Okay, it had a heyday in our worker package.json file. Again, I'm not sure why it's feeling like it needs to rewrite all my package.json files. I squint my eyes, I can see what I think it's doing, which is adding the baton store package. So I'm going to open this file up, but revert the changes, and I will just go in and manually add in the store package myself. That's much simpler. Okay, in our worker, let me go ahead and run a pnpm install to make sure these types come through. There we go. So these types should come through here. Great. We've got store billing update subscription quantity. So assuming that exists, that's good. I would like to move this to its own file though. So move this to its own file like jobs / send workspace invite. So this job up here already has its own file with a kind of a function, a job runner. I want to do the same thing here. So let's see if it will do that for us. Okay, so it's added a jobs file. I think it's taking things too far again. Stop. Okay, I'm going to stop that. I didn't actually want it to do that much. Okay, we did want to split this out into its own file. That's good. We do want this to call the store and update the subscription quantity in this job. That's good. Okay, our queue, we did add the job definition. That's good. And then in billing, I think, okay. Why? Okay, we're going to revert all of that. We'll try one more time here. This one's been surprisingly challenging. So in our store billing file, implement the update subscription quantity function. Okay, let's see what that did here. So to our store package, it added an update subscription quantity, which takes a workspace ID. That's what we want. It's finding the workspace. It's even going ahead and looking at the people and figuring out the quantity there. Now, this is not the exact calculation for our specific use case. We need to make sure that the person object is also associated with the user. Also, this functionality is a little bit duplicated now because there is another place where we're grabbing the active user account, and that is here whenever we're creating the checkout link. So I actually want to take this code and share this functionality with both the checkout session creation and the function to update subscription quantity. Break this out into its own function to count the active users. Okay, great. So it created a function, get active user count for workspace. It's a promise of a number, and it gets the count. So it counts the people in the workspace who are not archived who have a user. Great. Exactly what we wanted. So it is now utilizing that function in the checkout session creation, and it should be utilizing that function, yes, here in update subscription quantity in getting the active user count. So let's take one more detailed look at this. So in update subscription quantity, we are getting the workspace. If it doesn't have a Stripe customer ID, then we return. So that's good. So meaning if they're not associated with a Stripe customer, we won't continue. Now it's utilizing Stripe to fetch their subscription. We should already have that persisted to our database, but perhaps it's a good idea to get it fresh here. If there's no subscription, then we return. If there is a subscription, then we'll go ahead and get the first item, get its quantity. If it doesn't equal the new quantity, then it will update it. So that's pretty nice. If it's already the same quantity, then it won't call to update it. And then it'll update it to the new quantity, which is the getting the active user count. Fantastic. That looks good. All right, so our current user count is 3. If I archived a person, that should make it 2. So I've pulled open my sandbox Stripe environment here, and I'm looking at this workspace, and it currently has 3 people. So if I go into my GraphQL console here again, my workspace has 3 people. Let's say we wanted to archive one of these people. So we'll archive Dustin here. We'll grab his ID, and I've already created a mutation here to archive the person, passing in our workspace ID and person ID. So if I run this, what should happen is this should queue up a job. This job should run and then push over to Stripe and update to our quantity. So if I go back to our Stripe dashboard and refresh, still 3. Okay, so something happened. I'm guessing it's an environment variable. Okay, I had an environment variable issue. I have fixed that up, and I've unarchived Dustin, so let's archive him again. There we go. If I go over to Stripe here now and refresh, we have 2. Excellent. Okay, so that is updating subscription quantities. Let's commit our changes. Update subscription quantity on user count change. We're almost to the end. The last thing is we want to be able to give users the ability to manage their billing. So managing their payment methods and even canceling their subscription if they unfortunately need to. So we're going to add an API in order to do this and create the business logic for this in our store package. Implement step 6. Okay, great. Let's accept all and review the changes. So in our store, it's adjusting some of the data structures of how it's returning the checkout sessions and billing portal session to make them consistent of just returning a URL instead of a checkout URL in the checkout session. It's added a function for creating a billing portal session by workspace ID. So that's good. So it's added finding the workspace and then creating the billing portal based upon the customer ID and adding in a return URL appropriately using our slug this time. It's learned and returning that URL. Great. It's also updated our checkout URL to URL and exported the function. Fantastic. Over in our API, it's added a create billing portal session mutation to return an object this time. Again, it's learning what we like of returning a URL there. It did not update this, so it did not update the checkout URL. So let's just, might be easier just to do that manually. URL, and that should be it. And finally, it's updated our documentation to include docs on updating the billing portal, or rather creating a billing portal session. That looks good. Okay, let's test this out. So over in our GraphQL console, instead of creating checkout session, which by the way is not checkout URL anymore, it is just URL. That still works. Let's instead create a billing portal session. Great. And this workspace is an active customer, so we should be able to open up this billing portal and see what we have going on here. So we have 2 different users for $30 a month. We can see our payment method. We can cancel our subscription if we wanted to. We can change our payment method, add a payment method, update our billing info, see our invoice history, everything here. So let's commit this up. Add mutation for generating billing portal URL. Well, we did it. So we created from scratch, kind of. I mean, we already have the app, but we created from scratch the billing interface with Stripe for handling end-to-end subscriptions, both updating our database model. We've added Stripe checkout sessions for the initial checkout. We've listened to webhooks to process events in synchronized state. We've added fields to GraphQL for our UI to be able to know when people are subscribed and which plan. We've added the ability to update the billing in Stripe or the subscription quantity when users are added or removed. And then finally, the manage billing portion for starting a billing portal session with Stripe for the user. Of course, this logic is going to be specific to your app, but all these same steps at a high level are what you would need to implement subscriptions. So while this code isn't open source because it is our closed source app, I am going to open source this plan that we've been working off of here. So I'll add a URL to the description for this, and you can take these steps yourself, modify and apply them to your code base as you want to implement subscriptions, and maybe utilize AI like I did here with Cursor to be able to implement this in your code base. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you have any tips for how I could improve my own Cursor process, I would love to hear those in the comments below. All right, well, have a good one, and I will see you next time.